Year 4, Part 4. David and Suzanne went to England for a trip that spring, and the Longhouse was closed for the summer. Pat missed them terribly, but Judy and Ray were consolable. That Suzanne has been trying ever since she come to make a match between her brother and Patsy, Judy told Cuddles. I've been fearing lately she'd manage it, and him as soon be using hair tonics. Patsy hasn't any other beau after her just now. The men do be getting discouraged. Somehow the word do be going round she thinks nobody good enough for her. And there really isn't a man in the Glens she couldn't have just by crooking her finger, said Ray thoughtfully. I think it's just that way she has of saying, I know, sympathetically, and she doesn't mean a thing by it. Do you be thinking, Cuddles, that there's any chance of Jingle coming home this summer now? Ray shook her head. I'm afraid not, Judy. He's got a big contract for building a mountain inn in B.C. A splendid chance for a young architect. Besides, I think he has grown away from us now. He and Pat will never be anything but good friends. You can't make him jealous. I know, for I've tried. So I'm sure he doesn't care for her, except just as she cares for him. Do you know, Judy, I think it would be better if the uncles and aunts, and perhaps all of us, would stop teasing Pat about beaux or their absence. She thinks the whole clan is bent on marrying her off, and it rouses the Gardner obstinacy. There's a streak of it in us all. If you hadn't been so contemptuous of poor Larry Wheeler, I don't believe I'd ever have given him a second thought. Girls do be like that, I'm knowing, but I'd like to see both you and Patsy snug and safe, with someone to care for you afore I die, Cuddles darlint. Ray laughed. Judy, I'm only 17, hardly on the shelf yet. And don't you talk of dying. You'll live to see our grandchildren. Judy shook her head. I can't be polishing off a day's work like I used to, Cuddles dear. Oh, we all have to grow old, and you haven't learned yet how quick time do be passing. As for Pat, resumed Ray, I think perhaps she'll never marry. She loves Silverbush too much to leave it for any man. The best chance David has is that the Longhouse is so near Silverbush that she could still keep an eye on it. Do you know that Norma is to be married this summer? I've been hearing it. Mrs. Bryan will be real easy in her mind now with both of her girls well settled. Norma'll never have to lift a hand. Not that I do be thinking her beau is any great shakes of a man with all his money, though he comes of a real aristocratic family. His mother now, she was one of the Summerside Macmillans, and never did she be letting her husband forget it. She kept up all the Macmillan traditions, never wore the same pair of silk stockings twice, and her maid had to be saying, Dinner is served, madam, just like that, afore she could ate a bite, with service plates and all the flat silver matching. And in season and out of season, she did be reminding her husband she was a Macmillan along with everybody of any importance on the island. It was lucky he had a bit of humour in him, or it might have been after being a trifle monotonous. Will I ever be forgetting the story I heard him tell on the Madam one celebration at the Bayshore? It was when his boys, Jim and Davy, were two little chaps, and Jim did be coming home from church one day, real earnest, and says he to Davy, the minister did be talking of Jesus all the time, but he didn't be saying who Jesus was. Why, Jesus Macmillan, of course, says Norma's beau, in just the tone of his mother. Mr. Macmillan did be roaring at it, but your Aunt Honor thought it was terrible irreverent. Anyway, a Gardner is as good as a Macmillan any day. And now I must be making a few cookies. Little Mary will be coming over for a week. She do be so like Patsy when she was small. Sometimes I'm wondering if the clock is turned back. She do be always saying good night to the wind like Patsy did. And the questions of her. Have I got to go to bed, Judy? Can't I be little bad sometimes when I'm alone with you? And what's the use of washing my face after dark, Judy? Sure, and it's a bit of sunshine when she comes, and I'm thinking the very smallest flower in the garden do be glad, never to mention the cats. Pat was really far more interested in Ray's matrimonial prospects than her own, for Ray seemed to be swithering, as Judy put it, between two very nice young men, Bruce Madison of South Glen and Peter Allward of Charlottetown were both camping on the doorstep and were frightfully and romantically jealous of each other, turning, so it was said, quite pale when they met. Life, as Tillytuck said, was dramatic because of it. Pat had nothing against either of them, except that they meant change, and sometimes it was thought that Ray favored one and then the other. She discussed them as flippantly as usual with Pat and Judy, but both Pat and Judy were agreed that it was highly probable she would eventually decide on one of them. Pat hated the thought, of course, but if Ray had to marry someday, of course it wouldn't be for years yet. It must be somebody living near. Pat inclined to like Peter best, but Judy favored Bruce. We would make an awfully good-looking couple, agreed Ray. I really like Bruce best in summer, but I have a rankling suspicion that Peter would be the best for winter. And he always makes me feel beautiful. That's a knack some men never have, you may have noticed. But then, his nose. Have you noticed his nose, Pat? It's not so bad now, but in a few years it will be very bony and aristocratic. I can't exactly see myself eating breakfast every morning of my life with it opposite me. And it's terrible to think that my daughters might inherit it. It wouldn't matter so much about the boys. A boy can get away with any kind of nose, because few girls are as sensitive to noses as I am. But the poor girls. Judy was horrified, but she had no great liking for Peter's nose herself. So Silverbush had its own fun out of the haunting suitors, and the golden age seemed to have returned, and nobody took anything very seriously until Pat went to a dance at the Bayshore Hotel, and Donald Holmes, as Ray announced at the breakfast table next morning, fell for her with a crush that could be heard for miles. What was more, Pat blushed. Actually blushed when Ray said this. Everybody drew the same conclusion from that blush. Pat had met her fate. At once, everybody in the Gardner clan sat up and took notice. For the rest of the summer, Donald Holmes was a constant visitor at Silverbush. Ray and her two jealous suitors no longer held the center of the stage. Everybody approved. The Holmes family had the proper social and political traditions, and Donald himself was the junior partner in a prosperous firm of chartered accountants. Oh, that do be something like now, Judy told Tillytuck delightedly. There's braid in there, and he'll wear well. Patsy was in the right be waiting. Methinks I smell the fragrance of orange blossoms, symbolically speaking, Tillytuck remarked to Uncle Tom. Well, it's about time, said Uncle Tom, who was not given to symbols. It's really better luck than she deserves, after all her flirtations, said Aunt Edith, rather sourly. Pat herself believed she was in love, really in love. There were weeks of pretty speeches and prettier silences, and enchanted moons and stars and kittens, though in her secret soul she suspected him of not caring overmuch about cats. But at least he pretended to like the kittens. One couldn't have everything. He was well born, well-bred, good-looking, and charming. And for the first time since the days of Lester Conway, Pat felt thrills and queer sensations generally. "I thought I'd left all that behind with 17, she told Ray. "But it really seems to have come back." Ray, who was expecting one of the men she's engaged to, à la May Binney, carefully perfumed her throat. "A plain answer to a plain question, Pat. Do you mean to marry him?" "I'm not Betty Baxter," said Pat with a twinkle. "Don't be exasperating. Everyone knows he means to ask you. Candidly, Pat, I'd like him very much for a brother-in-law." Pat looked sober. In imagination, she saw the paragraph in the Charlottetown papers announcing her engagement. "I blush when I hear his step at the door," she said meditatively. "I've noticed that myself," grinned Ray. "And I suffer agonies of jealousy if he says a word of admiration for any other girl. On the whole, I haven't quite made up my mind. Not quite, but I think, Ray, when he says, 'Will you please?' I'll say, 'Yes, thank you.'" Ray got up and hugged Pat chokingly. I'm glad, and yet I'm on the point of howling." "Confidence for confidence, Ray. Which, if either of your young men, do you intend to marry?" Ray pulled an ear of Skudunk, who was sitting on his haunches on her bed, gazing at the girls with his usual limpid, round-eyed look. Gentleman Tom looked as if all the wisdom of the ages was his. Bold and Bad looked as if life was one amusing adventure. But Squidunk always looked as if he could be a kitten forever, if you wanted to. "Pat, I wish I knew. I've been horribly flippant about it, but that was just a cover-up. I really don't know. I do like them both so much. Pat, is it ever possible to be in love with two men? It isn't in books, I know, but in life? Because I do love them both. They're both darlings. But, Pat, honestly, the minute I decide I like Bruce best, I find I have a mind to Peter, and vice versa. That's all I can say yet. Well, Norma's wedding comes off next week. Judy is furious because they are going to rehearse the whole ceremony in the church the night before. "Next thing, there'll be a rehearse in the funerals," she says. "Judy will simply mad with delight if you marry Donald, and yet she'll die of sorrow when you go. When you go, that turns me cold. Oh, Pat, wouldn't life be nice and simple if people never fell in love? I wish I could make up my mind between Bruce and Peter, but I just can't. If I could only marry them both." The shrieks of an anguished car resounded from the yard, and Ray ran down to welcome Bruce. Or it may have been Peter. The next afternoon, Pat, as she expressed it, put off Martha and put on Mary, and hied herself to her secret field. Although there was apple jelly to make and cucumbers to pickle, she went through the mysterious emerald light of the maple woods, where it seemed as if there must have been silence for 100 years, and sat down on an old log covered with a mat of green moss in the corner of the field. It had changed so little in all the years. It was still her own, and it still held secret understanding with her, but today something came between her soul and it. In spite of everything, something touched her with unrest, the certainty of coming change, perhaps. She looked up at a splash of crimson in the maple above her head. Another summer almost gone. There was a hint of autumn and decay and change in the air. Even the air of the secret field, with the purples of its bent grasses. Yes, she would marry Donald Holmes. She was quite sure she loved him. Pat stood up and waved a kiss to the secret field. When she next saw it, she would belong to Donald Holmes. She had intended to call at Happiness on her way home. She had not been there all summer, but she did not. Happiness belonged to things that were, things that had passed, things that could never return. She was in the birch grove when Donald came to her the next evening. Donald Holmes was really a fine chap, and deeply in love with Pat. To him, she looked like love incarnate. She had a kitten on her shoulder, and her dress was a young leaf green with a scarlet girdle. There was something about her face that made him think of pine woods and upland meadows and gulf breezes. He had come to ask her a certain question, and he asked it, simply and confidently, as he had a right to ask it. For if any girl had ever encouraged a man, Pat had encouraged Donald Holmes that summer. Pat turned a little away from his flushed, eager face. Through a gap in the trees, she saw the dark purple of the woods on Robinson's Hill, the blue sheen of the Gulf, the green of the clover aftermath in the field of the pool, the misty opal sky, and silver bush. She turned to Donald and opened her lips to say, yes. She found herself trembling. I'm terribly sorry, was what she said. I can't marry you. I thought I could, but I can't.